This lecture is going to talk about virus transmission and how it relates to tissue tropism. So this is something I want you to think about for the specific virus you are researching. And transmission is basically talking about how do we get infected. So there's lots of different methods, and we'll talk about these individually. You can have direct contact, bodily fluids, skin-to-skin contact. You can have things that go out as aerosols. So you have droplets containing the viruses. Fomites are any kind of inanimate, I'm not going to spell it right, any kind of object that can get contaminated. So a desk, a doorknob, think of things that people commonly use that could have a little virus sitting on them that could cause infection to the next place. As you get further and further away, you are more protected from someone who is contagious, just because eventually the viruses are heavy enough to fall out of the respiratory droplets, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But just realize that there's many ways viruses can be transmitted, and this can relate to the type of tissues that they infect, right? So if something is transmitted through the air and you breathe it in through your nose and mouth, then it's likely going to infect those tissues and maybe down into your lungs. Whereas another mode of transmission that we'll talk about is, let's see if I can do this, is, oops, oh, why do you do that? I don't want that. There we go. Is the fecal oral route, which means virus leaves the body and then is contaminated, or is taken into the new host, usually by contaminated food or water or even contaminated hands. Those viruses usually infect the gut, right? Because they're going through that fecal oral route. So I want you to think about the connection between virus transmission and tissue tropism. And when we're talking about virus transmission, we're really talking about infection in a host, the virus getting out of the host, the virus finding a new host, the virus getting out of that host, and repeating this. So a virus wants to be able to replicate in a host and create lots of virions, infectious viruses, and then get into the new host and repeat. Okay. Remember, we've talked about basics of viruses. So we have our naked and we have our enveloped. And in general, naked viruses are more stable outside of the host because their outside is a nice stable protein structure, whereas enveloped viruses have a phospholipid bilayer. Okay. And you know that your skin is sensitive to drying out, just like your skin, which is covered with phospholipid bilayers of those cells. If an envelope gets dried out and you lose the conformation or the shape of those spikes, you're not going to have an infectious virus. So envelope viruses in general are less stable in the environment than naked viruses. So again, something to think about with your virus you're looking at. Okay, let's talk about horizontal transmission. Okay, this is like person to person. And we're really focusing on human viruses in this class. Oops, my other computer is dinging. My other computer, there we go. Turn that off. Okay. So how can we pass a virus from person to person? Okay, so bites, usually not human bites. We're usually talking about bugs, and we'll talk about this in a minute. So arthropods or some kind of biting insects. Some viruses can pass through kissing. Lots of viruses can pass through blood, whether it's sharing a needle or contaminated blood that gets into a microabrasion of another person. We know about sexually transmitted viruses. Skin to skin, some viruses are transmitted in the urine. Feces is what I'm talking about, the fecal-oral route. Breath, saliva, again. So we have direct contact and indirect, where it's really viruses are present either in the aerosols, the environment, especially like contaminated water or food, or on these inanimate objects, fomites. Some examples of viruses. Let me change my color. So some examples of respiratory viruses that you may have come in contact would be rhinovirus. Rhinovirus is the common cold. Rhino means nose, so it infects your nasal passages and you get clogged up. Another respiratory virus is influenza. I don't know why I can't spell when I write. SARS, or the coronaviruses, adenovirus, which is a virus that can infect your lymph nodes, so kind of like a strep throat feeling, but it's caused by virus. Fecal-oral route, poliovirus. Rotavirus, one of the main causes of gastro infections in young children. Hepatitis A, enteroviruses. These are basically gastric or viruses that infect your gut, digestive tract. Saliva and urine, so kissing. Cytomegalovirus. For those of you who are working on CMV, this is a super interesting virus because, excuse me, it can be passed from young toddlers to mothers, and if the mothers are pregnant, I mean, of course, it can be passed to fathers, but a pregnant mother with a CMV infection, CMV can actually cause microcephaly and conditions that look a lot like Zika virus. So one of the things I found interesting when I was first looking at CMV is this is a virus, in my opinion, the doctor should tell you about when you're pregnant and say, hey, be careful kissing your toddler on the mouth. You can transmit this virus if they're infected, and CMV can not cause a lot of symptoms in a toddler, but it can, like I said, cause a lot of damage to an unborn fetus. Epstein-Barr virus, which causes mono. We used to call it the kissing disease when I was a kid. That can be transmitted through the saliva, skin, hepatitis, sorry, not hepatitis, human papillomavirus, HPV. We'll talk about that virus this semester. Herpes viruses can be through skin, kisses, saliva, sex, some of the hepatitis viruses, HIV, Zika. So there's a lot of different viruses that fit all these categories. The main issue with the fecal-oral route is in countries with poor sanitation, poor hygiene. You can get a lot of contamination of food and water. And poliovirus is a naked virus, very stable in the environment and very hard for us to eradicate right now. On this poor little infected person, that I'm not having a good time spelling today, sites of entry that probably are most concerning are your eyes and your nose and your mouth, and then if you have blood or sexually transmitted or skin, any micro abrasions. There was a study I was reading that watched adults, and they touched their nose and eyes at least 4 to 5 on average times an hour. I am a horrible eye rubber. I'm always touching my eyes, and I know it's a nice instant portal to my body, and I try not to do it, but beware. Your eyes are a great in for a lot of different viruses. So airborne transmission or aerosols, I want you to think of the smaller the virus, the farther it can travel. So this is showing Ebola is a fairly big virus, about 790 nanometers in length. Measles is about 100 to 200 nanometers, so much smaller, so it can travel much further. The flu, influenza, is between 80 to 120 nanometers, right? And here we're talking over 6 feet. So it's not that you have to just protect yourself from the person sitting next to you coughing or sneezing on you. They could be 6, 8, 10 feet away and still release infectious virions into the air. Rhinovirus is a super small little virus. It's only about 30 nanometers. So it can travel really far, and there are so many types of rhinovirus. That's why you can continuously get a new cold that your body hasn't figured out how to deal with yet. And this is just showing you that it's not just the airborne breathing in, but it's droplets on your hands, droplets on other things like fomites, so kind of indirect contact. It's hard to stay sterile in today's society, so the likelihood that you're going to get a cold is very high. Fomites, like I said, are these inanimate objects. Some of the biggest spreaders of disease, both bacterial and viral, are toilets and air hand dryers. So toilets, when you flush them, there's this fine mist that can escape through all these little cracks. Even when you put the lid down, and you know that in public bathrooms you don't have the choice of putting the lid down. Sometimes you don't even have the choice of getting away from the toilet when it flushes. So it immediately aerosolizes all these viruses and microbes. These hand dryers, what do? You get this big blast of air, and all this aerosol goes right out there. So if you're standing next to someone who didn't wash their hands very well, they could be contaminating you by cleaning their hands. Common keyboards. So hopefully you don't have to use the computer labs too much on campus, or computers at the library. But if you do, make sure you wash your hands afterwards and don't touch your eyes and nose while you've been working on them. Common keyboards are one of the dirtiest spots that microbiologists have found. And your pillowcase. They have found lots of microbes that are normally found in the bathroom on people's pillowcases. So all these surfaces that are touched, that are, it says, repository sites like shelves, entertainment units, doorknobs that are touched surfaces, anything that can is commonly used or can collect things from the air. Those are great sources of microbes. So the main thing is wash your hands, don't touch your eyes, don't touch your nose, don't touch your mouth. Those are the main portals of entry for most aerosolized viruses. Vertical transmission means mother to child. And we're talking during pregnancy. So there are some viruses, and I'll show you on the next slide, that can cross the placenta. So they can infect in utero while the fetus is still forming. And usually the most severe results come if you have an infection during your first trimester of a pregnancy, because that's when a lot of the development of a fetus is happening. There are some viruses that can be transmitted through breastfeeding. One of them is Epstein-Barr virus, so the virus that causes mono. And they were seeing a lot of this in regions of Africa. The problem with telling mothers not to breastfeed is this is the main nutrient source for those babies. And so as a healthcare provider or a researcher, you have to weigh the risk of transmitting the virus versus the risk of malnutrition. Here in the more developed United States, we can go by formula, but not all people have that. And some viruses can be transmitted during birth. Sometimes this is avoided by doing a C-section. So let's take a look at those viruses. So highlighted in kind of a pinkish red color are some of the viruses. So the other ones are either bacteria or protozoa. But CMV, cytomegalovirus, parvovirus, rubella, measles, herpes simplex virus, HIV, Zika, chickenpox, Ebola, maybe some of the hepatitis, adenovirus, West Nile. Why can I not remember what LCMV is? Anyways, these can all potentially cross the placenta and infect the developing fetus. At time of birth, within the birth canal, herpes, hepatitis B, HIV, Ebola can be transmitted. In breast milk, again, cytomegalovirus, human T-cell leukemia, Epstein-Barr, HIV, Ebola, they think, maybe influenza. So being pregnant and infected can put the fetus or newborn baby at risk. You can also get transmission through vectors, right? So a vector is talking about the movement, in this case, of a virus. And we're really talking about insects here. So this isn't person to person, that's why you see all the red X's up here. This is through an insect. And sometimes down here, there's what we call a reservoir. Okay. So a reservoir is a natural host. They don't get the disease. but they are a source of infectious agent. So in this case for viruses, they harvest the virus that can then be transmitted through a vector such as a mosquito or a sandfly or a tick. These guys are usually called the carriers. So they're carrying the virus from person to person or from animal reservoir to person. Some of the most common vectors for viruses are mosquitoes. So we have the Aedes mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti, Aedes albopictus. We have the Anopheles mosquito, and we have the Culex. Sorry. Microbes are usually very specific to which mosquito species they can infect, but we're seeing that this is starting to change, and what I'm going to talk to you about is also the range of these insects has been shifting due to our changing climate. Two words I want you to be familiar with regards to vectors. There are mechanical vectors. Okay, so these are just transmitting insects. They don't have any role in the virus life cycle except to move it from host to host. And I'm not writing these by any specific organism, just writing in the space I have. There's also biological vectors. And that's where there's actually a requirement to require replication in the vector, so in the insect, for transmission. So if your virus is transmitted through insects, especially mosquitoes, take a look at whether that mosquito is a mechanical or a biological vector. We call these type of viruses arboviruses, which stand for arthropod-borne viruses. And here are just some examples. This is from the last slide. So you got yellow fever and dengue and West Nile, chikungunya, a bunch of encephalitis viruses. What else might you have heard of? A lot of these are kind of more rare. Here's just some pictures of a sandfly, a tick, and a midge, in case you don't know what those guys look like. This picture is to show you the range of some of these different mosquitoes in North and South America. So Aedes aegypti, which is known for transmitting yellow fever, dengue, chikungunya, and Zika, right? Huge presence, and this is showing you months of the year where these viruses may be being transmitted. The lighter colors mean it's less likely, or they're around fewer months of the year. Aedes albopictus also can transmit chikungunya, Zika, Filarius, which is not a virus, but in dogs it causes heartworm, in humans it can cause elephantitis. This is showing you the range right now of these two in the US. So in Colorado, not a lot of the Aedes aegypti, but definitely getting some Aedes albopictus. Colics, we're starting to see Zika, being transmitted by the Colics species of virus, West Nile, and several encephalitis viruses. And encephalitis just means, let me just make sure I'm going to say it right. Inflammation of the brain. So there are numerous viruses that can cause brain inflammation. And so wherever it's dashed or the lines across it, it shows there's been human infections, and then the color coding is the different years, and you can see this is not up to date. Lyme disease, this is not viral. This is bacterial, but I just put it here. This is spread by ticks to show you that the range of these ticks, this is the range of the ticks, is increasing over time. So as we're increasing our warming of the climate, right, these mosquitoes can live further and further up north. It's nice and warm. They're not going to die off. So climate change is a huge factor in spread of vector-borne diseases. And this is another one showing Aedes albopictus increasing its range as we get higher CO2 emissions, which, as you know, is greenhouse gases, which is warming the climate. Another type of transmission I want to talk about is zoonotic. So zoonotic we primarily define as animal to human. So if your virus is a zoonotic virus, take a look at which stage it is in the zoonotic diseases. Okay. For example, Ebola is already in stage 5, which means, I said Ebola and I wrote HIV. HIV is already in stage 5. Okay. HIV has adapted to people, but we are confident that it once came from non-human primates, so it was zoonotic. But now the virus that we have is person to person. And HIV, which stands for human immunodeficiency virus, doesn't infect and cause HIV type disease in non-human primates or mice or other kinds of animals. Ebola is here in stage 4. Nipah virus is here in stage 3. Well, they have it in stage... Oh, maybe I'm off by one. Sorry. There it is. Ebola is in stage 3. Sorry. I couldn't tell on my diagram here. I'm reading my notes from. Nipah is in stage 2. So take a look at these stages with respect to your virus. The guesstimate is about 75% of emerging diseases are mostly viral. There are some protozoan ones, and they're coming from animal reservoirs. So some examples of zoonotic viruses are influenza, HIV, SARS, Ebola. I'm going to put rabies over here because a lot of these have already moved from animal to human. Rabies is one that commonly still moves animal to human, right? So if you get bit by a rabid dog or raccoon or in contact with a bat, like I said, a lot of encephalitis type viruses. Hantavirus is over here in that it still is transmitted animal to human, as well as West Nile and Zika. Right? These are probably the ones you've heard of the most. And again, the issue is globalization, so more people, more chances for contact, deforestation, and all this stuff I'm talking about is from this reference, right? We're pushing animals out of their climate or their habitat, and so we're encountering them more often. Changing water flow, livestock, urbanization, hunting of bushmeat, exotic dining. If you're doing the Ebola, we think that came from bushmeat, which means people go out into the wild, catch wild animals for food, and that's one way that the virus we think has been transmitted to people. So this chart just gives you some examples and how they are, transmitted and what the reservoir is. So this is the animal, like I said before with reservoirs, this is the animal that the virus can naturally hang out, doesn't cause disease, but has the potential to move to humans. What I thought was interesting when I was reading about zoonosis is this image that really the biggest issue with zoonoses is on livestock keepers. So if we have these diseases that are jumping maybe from animal to animal species, right, and the diseases are affecting people's livestock, even if they're not infecting the human directly, they're affecting their ability to make money, have food for their family, things like that. So another thing we have to keep in mind about is it's not just us humans that can have issues with viruses jumping from species to species. If you want to read a cool book about zoonosis and emerging diseases, Spillover is a great, each chapter is a different story about how a virus has moved. I think there's one bacteria in the book, but mainly viruses have moved from animals to humans and kind of the discovery of how that happened. So I'd highly recommend that book. So just to come back to where we started, again, I want you to look at the transmission route for your virus that you've been assigned and connect it to tissue tropism. So how does it make sense? So remember, I'm working on influenza, and influenza affects the upper respiratory tract, and so that makes sense because its transmission is aerosol, right? And that's where it's going to hit this second guy. A little bit with fomites, and especially if he rubs his eye or maybe picks his nose or maybe puts his hand in his mouth, but definitely with this airborne transmission, it really correlates to the tissue tropism, the specific cell types or tissue types that the virus will infect. All right, that's all I've got for you.